Well, welcome everyone to today's Cultivating Success webinar. Our topic today is unpacking and planning for the true costs of owning and leasing farmland. This is the last webinar in our 2021 webinar series. We're really happy that you were able to join us today. The Cultivating Success program was established by University of Idaho, the nonprofit organization Rural Roots, and the WSU Food Systems program. We are now in our 21st year. Just a couple of webinar tips. I think we're pretty familiar with Zoom these days. However, if you are running into any problems with your sound or the speed of transitions, it might be helpful to close the other programs that are running on your computer. You can always check out problems by typing into the chat, which you'll find in your control bar at the bottom of the screen. Mackenzie is on standby to help with any tech problems. At any time, if you have questions for myself, as I am the speaker today, you can type those into the Q&A box. I will stop several times to be able to answer questions today. This webinar is being recorded, and the slides and the other handouts that I'm going to reference today are going to be available tomorrow on the Cultivating Success website. Mackenzie also sent those slides and handouts to you in an email this morning. If you have an opportunity to open those during the webinar, that could be helpful. I'm Colette DePhelps. I'm an area educator with Community Food Systems with University of Idaho Extension, and I'm located on the Moscow campus. Mackenzie Lawrence, my colleague, who's the administrative coordinator for the Community Food Systems and Small Farms program in the Northern District, will be our moderator today. Just a little bit more about myself. I was involved in a project with the American Farmland Trust to develop curriculum for people who are looking for land to farm. This was a 4-year project, and it was funded by the USDA. The slides that I'm showing you today and some of the resources in the handouts are based on the curriculum that was developed in collaboration with the American Farmland Trust. So as we move through the slides later, you'll see the American Farmland Trust logo, and that's just to honor their contribution to today's topic. So what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to be talking about the true costs of farmland and how you determine what those are. So the topics are financial factors affecting land tenure. We're going to delve a little bit deep into those. And then I'm going to talk about financial information that buyers and lenders want to see, some key financial statements, and how to put together a cash flow budget. So with that, let's talk about 3 basic paths to land access. That can be leasing or renting land, buying land, or perhaps accepting a gift of land or inheriting land. So generally, we hold land, which we call land tenure, in one of these 3 frames, and we have some type of agreement around holding that land. We may have a lease or rental agreement. We may have some type of financial document that is with a bank or a credit union in terms of purchasing land, or even perhaps from an individual. Or we might have a long-term process about inheriting land from a family member, or some type of other succession planning where we are taking over an existing farming operation. So within those agreements, there are always financial considerations. And those financial considerations are key things that we need to think about when we're talking about the true cost of land. So some of the factors that can affect your land tenure decisions, how you're going to hold land, whether you're looking for land to lease or buy, or working through some type of inheritance or gift situation, are your personal and business goals. And this is really what should be driving your land access decisions. What is it that you want in terms of your personal quality of life? If you have family members or a farm partner, what are their goals? And how do those play into the business goals? And how much money your operation is going to need to make, or how many goods are going to need to be produced. And while I say goods or money, it's because lots of times when we're farming, part of our business goals is actually providing for our family. And it's important to understand that there's an economic benefit to whatever you produce for yourself. So thinking about that within your business goals, and that's part of your business strategy, is to provide for yourself so you're not buying things off a farm. Another key consideration is your current financial position. Are you in a position to be able to access land by purchasing it or leasing it? And what are the capital needs of your business? So what do you need to put into your business to raise your crops or your livestock? So what is that cash flow going to look like? And what are those returns on that investment? And that's what we're talking about with the earning potential of your business. How much money can you really make? And how much of that money that you make can be applied to the costs of holding and utilizing land? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can start to think through what those different costs are, and you can do better planning. So land tenure situations always come with financial obligations, and it's really important to understand what those are. There's no such thing as free land. There are costs to obtaining land, improving land for its desired use, and maintaining that over time. And then you have to factor in some of those things that come with land, like property taxes, upkeep, and insurance. And these things are things that you have to consider whether or not you're buying or leasing land, or even using property that you're getting free from a family member or a friend. So we're going to talk about what some of those costs are so that you can think through them, and then you know where you need to have conversations about who's going to pay the costs related to land. We call these carrying costs. So carrying costs are the costs in addition to the rent payment or to the loan payment. So these are the costs that we consider whenever we're using land. And as I mentioned, we have property taxes. We also have water and other utilities that come to the land. Generally, when we're farming, we have some type of irrigation system that needs to be maintained, whether that is flood irrigation, whether we're in part of an irrigation district and we have access to water that way, or we have a well and we need to either put the well in or we need to maintain it. We need to have a pump. All of those things are some of the carrying costs related to water. So it's really important to think through those and how much does it cost to have water. Mackenzie and I were on a farm in Lewiston, Idaho on Friday. And for that particular farm, it was a piece of leased ground. Their cost for being in the irrigation district was a flat $1,000 a year. That was part of the carrying cost of being able to operate that 3-acre piece of land. There might also be some conservation practices, and these can be practices that maybe are required by the landowner or by a jurisdiction such as the federal government. If you are in some area where there's a particular habitat for an endangered or threatened species, you're going to need to pay attention to that. You might also be using land that's under contract with like the Natural Resource Conservation Service for some type of conservation practices. And there might be a cost share for doing those conservation practices. Still, there's a cost to doing them, whether that's using buffer strips or thinking about putting in beneficial insect habitat. Those are all things that are conservation practices that can really benefit your farm operation, but they do have a cost that you need to consider. Also, landowners may want to see you practice certain types of conservation on their land if you are in a lease situation. And it's going to be important to talk about who's going to cover the costs of not only the actual infrastructure and materials and supplies for the conservation, but also the labor and the time that is dedicated to those practices. You might need to improve things or restore part of the land. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in some upcoming slides. And maybe there's some special assessments that are on the land. Perhaps that you are going to need to look at road maintenance or some other type of infrastructure that you're going to need to pay for. We also need to really look at the health and the condition of the natural resources, because when you come to a piece of property, it might be in excellent condition. The soil might be perfect for production, but maybe it's not. Maybe you need to improve that soil. Maybe you are in a situation where the property has been in one use and you want to convert it from, let's say, pasture to row crop production. And you need to do some soil testing. You might need to do some soil amendments. You might need to do some weed abatement. Those are all costs that are associated with that piece of land. And when you're assessing whether or not you can afford a piece of land, you need to understand what you're going to need to put in it to be able to get that return on investment that you're expecting. I talked a little bit about water sources, but also quality and quantity. If you're in a situation where you have a well, but you don't have a high flow rate, so your gallons per minute on that well are pretty low, you might have to put in water storage to be able to pump into that storage and then to be able to feed off of it. You're also going to need to test the water to make sure that the quality meets the use that you need and that you have access to water for production, but also for whatever processing you need to do. So especially if you're in a situation with fruits and vegetables and you want to rinse those before you take them to market, you're going to need to have potable water. And if you're on an irrigation district, you might not have potable water at the farm. And so then you have to think about where you're going to be able to set up that rinsing and cleaning station. So again, those are additional costs that you have to think about when you're thinking about a land decision. So sometimes we think about these costs more in the operational side, but they really key back to what's available on the land that you're using. And so I'm trying to help you have kind of this broader perspective of what the true costs of land are, because the assets the land has or doesn't have are going to affect how much money you need to put in it and when you need to put that money into it. Again, you might have forest land or some type of wetlands protected habitat that you need to create some buffers around or do some maintenance on. Those can be benefits in terms of looking at ecological benefits of having more wildlife, particularly like beneficial insects habitat. You might be valuing those wetlands for some of your quality of life, or those forests for a timber-based enterprise. So they could be returns on your investment. Again, you need to maintain them, so there's some costs associated with that. And then when you're thinking about pastures and perennial crops, those are things that require maintenance. They might require you put in cover crops in between your rows. You might be looking at having to take pasture out, renovate pasture. How are you going to control noxious weeds? That's something that we often see in pastures. And pastures do have to be fertilized and maintained over time. So if you come into a situation where you're assessing the quality of several different pieces of land, if you have to do a lot of pasture renovation on one, you need to think about that as part of the carrying costs of that land. So thinking about infrastructure and improvements that you need to do to infrastructure is important. So when we talk about this, we're talking about the location, the suitability, and condition of perhaps the housing that you have. And that might be for animals, or it might be buildings, barns, sheds, hoop houses that you're using for storing equipment or for producing crops. If these things don't exist, you're going to have a cost of putting them onto the land if you need to use them. If they do exist, you're going to need to see how structurally sound they are. If you're purchasing a land, then you're going to have to be thinking about, you're going to be 100% responsible for any maintenance and improvements on those structures. If you're leasing land, that's a conversation with the landowner, is whether or not they're going to invest in that or you're going to invest in that, or you're going to split those costs, because the total asset benefit of things that don't leave the property are maintained by the landowner. However, you might need improved facilities to operate your farm or ranch operation. Farm roads and driveways are another thing that definitely on the property you're going to need to maintain, but you might also have some type of maintenance agreement to get to the property. Again, a carrying cost to consider. Things like fencing. Do fencings need to be improved? Do they need to be maintained? Even if you're doing a market garden, if you have a lot of wildlife intrusion, you might have to fence that market garden. So that's part of the carrying cost that you need to consider. Some other infrastructure improvements, again, thinking about the location of where they are in the farm and their suitability and condition, are the water systems, the irrigation, the wells, the filtering, etc. So if you're having to move water from the entry point to the property to the fields, there could be a considerable cost to that. And so thinking through that is part of what it's going to cost to farm on that piece of land. So septic systems and other utilities are something that you might consider. If you're using a piece of ground and you have to bring a porta potty in, that doesn't really sometimes seem like a carrying cost, but it actually is, because if that property doesn't have bathroom facilities, you're going to need to think about how are you going to access them, or are you going to have to leave that property to use some facilities. And then also thinking about food safety, hand washing facilities. If you don't have potable water at your site, you're going to need to bring in a hand washing station that allows you to wash your hands properly so that you're practicing proper food safety. Again, I mentioned conservation practices before, but you may need to put in things like windbreaks if you're in a really windy area, or like I said, cover crops, other things that will have a cost and a benefit to your operation. And then there might be some other facilities which affect your production operations and your options. And, you know, there are some things like planning and zoning that can affect whether or not you can have those facilities on the property that you're looking at. So when we talk about these carrying costs, and particularly with leases, because if you buy a piece of land, you are responsible for everything. But if you're leasing, then there's some questions that come up, like who is responsible for routine maintenances and routine maintenance of what infrastructure? These are things that you need to talk about with a landowner, and then you need to spell out in your lease agreement. I always recommend that you have a written lease agreement, and that you consider that lease agreement to be a conversation tool, so you can be really clear about who is paying for what the expectations are in terms of leasing that land. And then again, going back to who will pay for and who will own the improvements. Ultimately, when you're in a lease situation, the landowner is going to own the fencing unless it's movable fencing, but anything permanent, they're going to own. And so really thinking through who is paying for the installation and upkeep of that equipment, especially if you can't take it with you, and how do you negotiate that in a lease? If you are considering a lease agreement, I'm going to show you my email at the end of this program. I would really like for you to email me. I can send you a great document that helps you think about the value of infrastructure that's already on the farm in the lease, but also a lot of questions about who's paying for what. And, you know, all of these things are things that you want to figure out before you sign the dotted line. You'll also want to know if there's any limits on the types of crops or livestock that you want to produce, whether that's on the landowner's side or some type of zoning or you know, some other jurisdiction at the state level or the local level on that piece of property. Because if you're planning on having specific enterprises that are going to give you that return on investment that you need to pay your land costs and your carrying costs, you want to know up front that you can do those on this property. And then another question you might consider is subletting allowed? So for instance, perhaps you only have an option to lease 100 acres, but for your operation, you only plan to use 20 of those acres. Are you able to sublet the other 80 acres maybe to somebody for grazing or some other use under your lease agreement and help you pay for that lease cost? These are all things to know in advance. So what I suggest that you do is that you really take stock of your resources. So you know what it is you already have, and then what it is you're going to need to do the farming operations that you would like. And so when we talk about resources, we talk about the physical resources. So looking at the land itself, looking at the soil, looking at the water that's available, thinking about the acres, what the cost is for those, some of the infrastructure that you might need. Marketing resources, we're talking about what are your access to market. Are you able to do a farm stand if that's what you want to do on the locale where you're farming, or do you need to do that in another area? Management and labor. If you have some high labor crops, such as like raspberries or maybe strawberries, are you going to need to bring in some people to help you seasonally? And do you, in the area that you're looking at farming, where you're looking for land, have access to those labor resources? Financial resources, definitely looking at where can you get funding? What if you need an operating loan? You can't cash flow. You know your business is going to be profitable in the end, but there's times where you're lean on cash. Are there places that you can get an infusion of cash to float your operation until your sales come in? And then what professional and technical assistance do you have to help you do things like evaluate land, set up your business, so you make sure that you're doing your taxes right, that you're able to file as a farm, do the kind of record keeping that you want. So one of the handouts that I have provided to you today is a worksheet to help you start to do this inventory. And as you can see for this slide, for some of these things, I'm really trying to help you also think about what it is you already have. If you have to improve it, what the cost would be, or if you had to purchase something or build something new, what would the cost of that be? So this is really a tool for you to start to think through your farm and ranch enterprises, think about the cost of production and marketing, and start to really lay those things out so you can do some really solid financial planning. And it might not mean that you're going to get everything that you want up front. You'll be able to prioritize where do you need to actually put your money and your resources in your overall farm plan. So again, this is a Word document that I sent out, and you can go back through the slides, think through all of those carrying costs that I talked about, make sure that you have them on this resource inventory worksheet, because it's not just what you have that you want in this worksheet, it's what you're going to need. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if I have any questions.
I don't see any questions so far.
Okay, great. At any time, please go ahead and put questions or comments into the Q&A. I'm happy to stop and answer those. So now I have some questions for you. And so as I move forward into talking about some of the financial information that lenders are going to ask for, that people who are leasing land are going to ask for, that you're going to need to create some key financial statements, you actually need to be able to compile your financial documents to create those. And so I have some questions to ask you. So I am launching a poll, and you should see this on your screen. This poll has 4 questions, and it is asking you if you can easily obtain some of the key financial documents that you would need. So you are able to actually complete this poll. And I see that some folks are starting to complete it, so you can answer the question. So can you easily obtain bank statements for the past 3 months? Can you easily obtain your tax returns for the past 3 years? Do you have a credit report that's less than 6 months old? And can you easily obtain investment or saving account statements for the past 3 months? And just so you know, this is your own sensing. This is an anonymous poll. So while we'll see what folks on today's webinar, know or don't know in general what they have access to, this is to help you think through some of the financial documents that are needed and whether or not you have access to them. So I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds. We have a few people that haven't completed the poll yet, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to do that. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll, and I am going to share the results. So this is great. We see that most people know where their bank statements are, their tax returns. A few people have a credit report, but a few folks still need to find, to actually get a credit report. And there are some places that offer credit reports for free, like Experian. So you can go ahead and do that and get a credit report and stay up on that. That's a really key piece of information. And then it says most people are able to obtain their investment or saving account statements for the past 3 months. So all of that is excellent. And I really encourage you to take the time to put that information together, because as we move through the presentation, I'm going to give you some ways that you can use that to understand your financial position. Okay, I have one more poll that I'm going to launch now. And again, this is about your key financial documents. So if you have credit cards, can you obtain your recent credit card statements? Also, if you have student loans or business loans, can you easily obtain those statements? So this is really looking at what some of your financial liabilities are, which really affect your cash position, how much money you have available to lease or buy land. And then any recent statements for mortgages that you're paying. And maybe you don't have mortgages, so it's not applicable. Or maybe you don't have credit cards, so it's not applicable. And then do you have a personal or business record keeping system in place? And this is something that's really key as you move forward, is that you want to be able to develop your record keeping skills. And a great place to start developing your record keeping skills is with your personal finances. Because what we're talking about today are all things that you have in your personal finances, and you're going to need to put them together anyway if you're going to definitely buy land. But as you may see, there could be landowners in a lease situation that also ask you for this information. I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds. So if you haven't completed the poll, go ahead and do that. Okay, I'm going to end the polling and share the results. So what we see, credit card statements, people are on top of that or not applicable. The same with statements for any student or business loans and mortgages. And then we have kind of a mix of people that are in process of developing a record keeping system. They already have one or they don't. So I think, you know, it's a great place to be in process. And it's a great place to be to say, okay, I don't have that, but now I'm gonna create it because I realize that it's important.
Colette, before we move on to the next section, there is a few questions that have come in if you want to take a minute to address those.
Okay, let me get this poll out of my my view. Okay, great, I'm happy to address those.
So Sheila asked, how do I go about finding out what, if anything, I need to do with some wetland areas on my property without spending a lot of money?
Okay, so I would start out by contacting your county assessor's office or your county planning and zoning, and just saying, you know, you have some wetlands. You're looking for the key people that you need to talk to about that. They might be able to, you know, to point you to some individuals at the state level or within a federal agency. So that's where I would start. So if you can go directly to an individual, that would be great. In Idaho, you might want to go to Idaho Department of Lands. If you want to go on the internet and search, and then reach out to them and say, I really want to understand what my obligations are here. You know, if you're in any way nervous about reaching directly to, you know, Department of Lands, Department of Environmental Quality, to the Environmental Protection Agency, all of these, you know, government entities that might have some type of jurisdiction or information to share, I would go to your extension office and talk to your local extension educator and see how they can help you. So in almost every county in Idaho, we have an extension office. If you go to uidaho.edu/extension, you'll come to where you can search and you can see who the educators are in your office or a nearby office, and that's a great place to start.
Awesome. And as you were chatting, I put some of those links in the chat for folks. Sheila also had another question. She has a seasonal creek running through her property that desperately needs to be cleared of downed trees and other accumulated debris. Can she clean this up, or would she need to get permission?
That is a great question, and it is one that I do not know the answer to. I would suggest that you reach out to your Natural Resource Conservation Service office. So that's a local USDA resource office, and ask them that question about the seasonal creek. They might say that they would come out and do a site visit. They might refer you to someone else about that. Also, it's really They're a great resource. Their acronym is NRCS, and they have some cost share programs for things like buffers and other environmental quality incentive programs on land. And so you may qualify for those programs, so you definitely want to talk to them anyway. That program is called EQIP. So that's short for the Environmental Quality Incentives Program.
We have just one more question. And I don't know if you're going to address this later in your presentation, but we had a question about where would you find land for sale in Idaho?
Okay, that's a great question. I don't have this in this particular presentation, though I do have a recorded webinar that's about land access and lists a lot of things on where to find land. So I will say that the growers that I know that have found land have found it in all different ways. So some have found it through a local realtor and a general MLS listing. Others have gone to specific sites, like they have found it by being on Craigslist, looking at individuals that have been selling land. Others have been like kind of looking at land and found that there were parcels of land that didn't appear to be used. They went to the county assessor's office. They looked up the owner of that land and actually sent them a letter, a really nice letter explaining who they were, what they wanted to do, wanting to know if that land would be available for sale or lease. Really, the bottom line is that you can leave no rock unturned. It is, especially now in this late stage pandemic, a real challenge to find affordable farmland. We have seen a lot of inflation of land prices. We don't know if this is going to hold or not. So it's really going through those online listings. There are some listings online that specifically look at rural ag land. And so you'll really just need to do that due diligence. You can also contact your local extension office. You can contact NRCS, your local conservation district, meet with some folks, develop relationships so people understand you and your readiness to secure farmland, and let them know that you are really a serious land seeker and that you have the capacity to be able to afford that farmland. And so really going through this webinar is a great first step to start to put the financial information together to demonstrate that you're somebody that it's really solid to have a conversation with. And Mackenzie and I also, we host the Idaho Farm Link program, which does have land seekers and landowners linked on that. And we did a survey of that platform. And one of the things that landowners came back and told us is that many times they were contacted by land seekers who, one, were just wanting land for free. And as you can see, there's a lot of carrying costs for landowners as well. And so no land is free for anyone. And so really understanding the financial aspects of land tenure is going to help you in a conversation with any landowner, whether you want to buy or lease. And just really coming with understanding what you can afford and what you can offer is important. So I do suggest looking at our recorded webinars, because I do have one specifically on land access that delves deeper into where to look to find land. Okay, if there's no other questions, I'll just keep going.
I don't see any at this time.
Okay, great. So I asked you all those questions. In the handout with the slides, you do have this checklist so you can pull your key financial documents together. So why am I asking about this? Because it's really key to what lenders and landowners are looking for. So as I've talked about, both leasing and purchasing land require a financial commitment, and a landlord will want to make sure you can make your lease payments on time. A lender will want to make sure that you can repay your loan. And both may require documentation to prove your credit worthiness. And I think this is really key. Sometimes people think, well, if I'm leasing land, I'm not going to have to provide this information. But absolutely, you will run into more and more. People are going to want to see some evidence that you're going to be able to make that lease payment and be able to make it on time. And it might mean that you negotiate when you make that lease payment, but just that you can make that lease payment. So there's three main financial statements that help you and a lender or a landowner understand your financial position. So there's a balance sheet that tells your current financial position. It lists your assets and your liabilities. There's an income statement that tells you whether you're making or losing money in your farming enterprises. And then there's a cash flow statement that helps you keep track of cash, where it comes from and where it goes. So I'm going to provide at the end of this program a link to where you can find some in-depth recorded programs that help you understand how to develop a balance sheet, an income statement, a cash flow statement, and an enterprise budget, which actually is very helpful with your income statement and your cash flow statement. So we'll provide those resources. We don't have time to jump in them today, but I wanted to tell you why they're important. What do they tell a lender or a landowner? Well, your track record of handling debt is in your credit report. But information about the down payments you can make really comes from that balance sheet, because with the balance sheet, you can identify what your net worth is. So do you essentially have assets that are more than your liabilities? And that's a key financial indicator. Your income statement and your cash flow budgets are going to help you and the lender or landowner understand your ability to repay the loan or pay the lease and when you could make those payments. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth when I jump into cash flow budgets. And then a fallback position. What happens if you have something unforeseen like a pandemic or a crop failure, a natural disaster? What happens if some income source that you counted on is not there? What is your collateral? That goes back to your net worth. How can you still pay those obligations in the absence of something that you expected? So this is why these financial statements are very important to lenders and landowners when you are looking to buy or lease land. So I want to delve a little bit into cash flow statements and then into the idea of creating a cash flow budget and a tool that I provided to you so that you can start doing that. So cash flow statements, this really details all the cash that you have as where all that cash goes. So it includes cash that comes in from your operating activities, which is on your income statement. You flow that in, but your operating activities are thinking about the sales from your different farm enterprises. So how much cash is going to come in from your egg sales? How much is going to come in from hay that you perhaps sell? Or maybe it's a service that you provide. Maybe you do custom haying during part of the year. That's cash that's coming in from your operating activities. You might also have some cash from investment activities. Maybe you have some dividends from investments that you plan to put into the cash flow option that you have. Or maybe you have a partner that is investing in your operation. And then there's cash flows from financing activities. And oftentimes farms need to have an operating loan because at some times of the year, they are cash poor and they need an infusion of cash to float them until their sales happen. So creating a cash flow budget, which is really a forward-looking cash flow statement, can be really helpful in starting to think about what can you afford and what financial obligations do you have with any piece of land. So it looks like at what you think your cash needs will be relative to what you expect for income throughout the year. So this is going to be, when does your income come in? When do your expenses go out? And cash flows often vary by time of year. So your cash flow budget addresses how you will deal with that. So for instance, if you're producing livestock and you have slaughter dates, and after the slaughter dates is when you actually have that sale of that animal, then most of your cash is going to come through at one time of year. So you're going to have to budget that cash throughout the year because you still have all your feed expenses, whatever, maybe veterinary or health, well-being expenses you have for your animal. You have infrastructure that you need to maintain, maybe transportation to different pastures. There's a lot of expenses that keep going through the year. However, your money comes in at one time. So how are you going to deal with that? That's where the cash flow statement comes in. So I have provided for you a cash flow statement that is a spreadsheet that has calculations built into it. This was developed as part of the American Farmland Trust Land Access Project. And it's something that you can use to develop a cash flow budget. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the different pieces of this statement, give you an idea of what you might put in there. And then again, this is a spreadsheet, so you can add lines, add other of those carrying costs that we talked about. So variable costs, these are the costs that change depending on what you're producing. So this is the income and expenses of your farm operations that are directly related to producing a specific product. So if you think you are raising poultry for eggs, so when you're thinking about that, you have the purchase of the poultry, you have the feed of the poultry, you have their, you might have some very specific costs in terms of movable fencing that's specific for that operation. And then you have the sales of those eggs that are going to come in. And maybe when you are retiring a bird, you're going to have what is essentially a stewing hen that you're selling. So you're wanting to look at when the income and expenses are going to be for raising those birds and getting those eggs to market. So other things that are going to be in here are some of your costs of going to market. And so you might have your egg cartons in this cost. You may have some other marketing costs that are specific to that operation that you're looking at. You also have fixed costs, or what we often call overhead. And so this is where a lot of those carrying costs are going to be listed. And so you might want to itemize them in this particular cash flow budget, or you might want to go back to that resource inventory where you made some notes about what the costs are and look at how those costs are going to be divided throughout the year. So you might have an insurance payment that only happens once a year in June. So that's when you're going to put it into your spreadsheet. If you have any types of loans, you're going to have interest that might be on a monthly level. You're going to have taxes, land rent, different repairs and utilities. When you're going to have to pay those are going to be in this cash flow budget. And then you're going to think about some of the other sources of and uses of cash. So you might be purchasing equipment. Perhaps you need a small rototiller and you're going to have to purchase that early in the season. Or maybe that's going to be purchased and you're going to have a payment plan. So you're going to spread that out through the season. You might sell a piece of equipment because you have an old rototiller and you're scaling up. You're looking at maybe funds that you're borrowing when those come in, and then when you need to make repayments on those. So these are all things that you put into your cash flow spreadsheet. And then it's going to do some calculations, and it's going to show you at the beginning of the month. So looking down here, how much cash did you begin with, and how much cash do you have at the end? And there's probably going to be times throughout the year when your ending cash is in a negative because you've had more expenditures that month than the income that has come in. So how you can use this budget is to think about where you're going to get the cash to cover those expenses. And where this comes in to be super helpful with thinking about your land tenure situation is you might be able to time some of your payments on your loans or on your leases when you are most have the most cash available. And so that might be at the end of your production season when most of your sales have been done. And so that could really help your cash flow. But what a lender's going to want to see, or what somebody who is going to lease land is going to want to see from you, is your cash flow. Here's my budget. Here's why I'm asking that I can pay this at the end of the year. And here's why I think I can pay it. You know, it might feel more secure to somebody who's leasing land to get a monthly payment. However, when they see that you have these key financial documents, that you've really done that work, they may say, okay, I feel confident that while your lease started in November, you can't pay me till September, I'm okay with that. So these are the types of tools that you need to use to be able to understand what it is you can do or you can't do. So where to start? For some people, you might not have farm records yet, or you might not be farming yet. You're thinking about farming. And so you can start with your personal finances. You can gather your financial documents, those key documents that we went through earlier. You can develop or continue developing a record keeping system. This might be something that you're computer oriented. You really want to do this on a computer, so you decide that you're going to use QuickBooks or Quicken. And we do have a webinar on the Cultivating Success website that compares QuickBooks and Quicken. And we have some extension educators that could help you think through that. So if that's something that you're interested in, just let me know. We do have somebody who's really working on this in Southern Idaho and is able to consult all across the state. You also can easily create a personal balance sheet because you have access to your personal finances. So you can create a personal cash flow budget and an actual cash flow statement. And then you can update those over time. Developing these skills using your personal finances is really going to help you translate that into a business situation. You're going to need to understand your personal finances to actually develop a cash flow budget that indicates when you need to draw money out of your farm business to pay yourself and cover some of your personal costs. So these things really do work together.
Colette, while we're on this topic, there was a question about record keeping, and if you have any recommendations about a record keeping method or system.
So I do suggest watching the Quicken versus QuickBooks. For people who really feel like they kind of easily pick things up on the computer, I think that that is an excellent and low cost system to use. You can either buy the program or you can get like a monthly low cost online version of it, and it will link right into your bank accounts and download your statements, and then you can allocate those expenses to different accounts and different enterprises that you have. For other people, they really like spreadsheets. The Organic Farmers Business Handbook has a disc that comes with it that has a lot of spreadsheets made. So the handbook is like $20 or $25, and maybe Mackenzie, it's by Richard Riswald, and it's something maybe you could find and put into the chat. We often recommend that handbook because it does have that CD and it's really business friendly. A lot of farmers have vetted it and found that it is really helpful. Another book that is really helpful is, let's see, I have to remember the name. Fearless Farm Finances. And that is another book that has a lot of sample spreadsheets in it that you can create either on the computer or you can do longhand on paper. The key thing is that you develop a record keeping system that works for you and not push yourself too far out of your comfort zone that you will avoid your record keeping. The other thing that works is to schedule time for record keeping. So whether that, is Tuesday morning from 9 to 11, every week or every 2 weeks or once a month, keep that schedule going. So it doesn't get so onerous that you find it difficult or you forget something. You might want to do it when your bank statements come in. That's a good time to reconcile all of your income and expenses. So again, we do have in some of the different webinars that are recorded on our website some good ideas. I'm also happy to talk through some options and provide some other extension educators that can be a resource for you if you're thinking about developing a record keeping system.
Awesome. There was one follow-up question to that about YNAB. I'm not sure what that stands for, but Cecilia asked, is that not suited to a business? And if you are familiar with that platform, do you like it?
I am not familiar with that platform. So I'm sorry that I cannot speak to that. That might be something that you want to contact your local small business administration. So our SBDC, which is our small business development centers, they're all across Idaho, they're across Washington and other states. If you go online, you can search them and you can actually set up a time to get free consulting from the staff in the Small Business Development Center. They also have a lot of very low cost classes on how to do things with different types of record keeping systems. So another great resource for you to be able to develop a record keeping system and even move into developing a business plan. So I definitely recommend you reach out to your Small Business Development Center. Oh, I see. You need a budget. I am not familiar with that. So I would definitely reach out to the Small Business Development Center and ask them if they're familiar with that and the pros and cons that they see for a farm business.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There was one question that pertains to something you touched on a couple slides ago. Can you briefly explain government payments, especially as they pertain to a lease situation?
Sure. So for instance, perhaps you have land that's in the Conservation Reserve Program that's part of a lease. So you're leasing grazing land and you're leasing 100 acres and 30 of those acres are in what we call CRP. There is a payment that is made to the land owner or whoever has the contract, that Conservation Reserve Program, for keeping that land out of production. So if you have land and you're in one of those types of programs that provides a payment like that for doing some type of service, in this case, it's keeping highly erodible land out of production, then you're going to want to put that into your financial planning. And so you'll also want to consider that if you're leasing land and you're managing the ground that is CRP, but that payment is going to the landowner, is there a way that you can get credit for taking care of that ground? Or maybe that ground is not included in part of your lease because they're already getting paid for that land being in a specific program, and then you're not obligated to manage that land in any way. So that's what I mean by government payments.
Perfect.
There are other payments that are related to commodities. If you are raising some commodities like small grains, that's something that you would want to reach out to the USDA Risk Management Agency and the Farm Services Agency to see what programs would apply to your operation.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, so again, going back to looking at land. So if you're evaluating 3 different properties and you are really clear what you need to operate your farm or ranch enterprises, you could develop a cash flow budget that would be based on the attributes of that specific property and use those to do some type of comparison of that land. Because that's a really nice way to think about what the costs are, the carrying cost of that particular piece of land. You could also do it not in a cash flow budget, but you could do it in an itemized list, a spreadsheet where you're putting down all the different items that would be carrying costs. Are those things that you would be responsible for? Yes, if you're buying land, and maybe if you're leasing land. But they're things to consider because those carrying costs can really tip the affordability of that land, kind of pro or con for you. Because if you have a lot of things that you need to do in terms of inputs that cost you money, maybe that means that a low lease payment doesn't make the land affordable. And so if we only look at the cost of the land in terms of our loan payment or our lease payment, we might really not be considering the true cost of the land. I would say we're not considering the true cost of the land and could get in a really tough situation because we haven't itemized out our carrying costs. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have some resources available on the Idaho Cultivating Success website under our recorded webinars, and you can go straight to this link. We have a number of recordings that are about financing. And so there's a 4-part series called Financial Fitness for Farmers. There are lots of examples of balance sheets, income statements, enterprise budgets, and cash flow budgets, and a recorded program to help you understand in depth the aspects of each of these key financial documents, and then give you some practice sheets where you can develop your own balance sheet and you have an example to work from and each of these other key financial statements. So with that, that's the end of our webinar today, my presentation. I'm happy to entertain any other questions that you might have.
There was a question in the Q&A box about the support that Extension offers for farm finances, and I did put Sydney Hill's contact information in the chat. I don't know if you want to speak a little more about that opportunity.
So Sydney Hill is part of a project that is offering support on developing record keeping to farmers of all different scales, all different levels of experience across the state. It's a really great opportunity to get some free consulting. She is an expert in Quicken and QuickBooks, and she and her husband also have a farm operation that they operate. So she has applied experience, and she can help you develop the record keeping system that you need and start to develop these key financial statements. She's also part of a benchmarking project where she's gathering information that is totally confidential, ultimately anonymous, to help develop some documents that help people understand for a specific type of operation, what are the average costs of operating that, so you can compare, are my costs high, are my costs low? And that helps you actually think about where is it that you might be spending too much money and how you might be able to be more efficient in your farm operation. She's a great resource. I really encourage you to reach out to her if you're looking for support.
Awesome, thank you. There's another question from Karen. She's asking, we're trying to estimate costs of getting long-term perennials in the ground like rhubarb, which is usually started from crowns, not seeds. Are there any good resources for finding suppliers for things like rhubarb crowns? They're located in Washington State.
Okay. So I think that what I would suggest that you do is maybe you can put Nicole Whittam's email address in the chat. Mackenzie, Nicole Whittam is the coordinator of the Washington Cultivating Success Program. They do have a Washington Farm and Ranch Resources email list, and you could ask Nicole to put out that query on the list. She's a small livestock producer, but linked in with the other producers in Washington, and she can help you identify some resources. Also, Rural Roots sponsors an email list, and we encourage people to participate in that list. It's free. We can help get you linked up to be on that list, and then you can put that question out to other farmers. That's what we found is the best way to identify where you can get affordable starts of any kind. And so definitely using those networks. You can also do your own online research and compare just by doing a Google search. When you do a Google search, you might look to see if you could find any what we call enterprise budgets for rhubarb, and that gives you those average costs of production related to rhubarb specifically. I haven't seen one out there for rhubarb. There's definitely a lot for all different types of crops and livestock. And so generally, if you find those that are coming out of a university, even if they're coming out of a university in Tennessee or another state, you can adapt them to your locale. So they're a great place to start.
Great. West also asked, he was curious who typically manages NRCS contracts. Is that a landowner or leasing farmer's responsibility? Is that up to the farmer and the landowner to decide?
So I think that's a great question. I would double check that with NRCS. I believe that those contracts are with the landowner. However, at times the leasee can be doing the work of that contract. So for example, I had a friend outside of Moscow. They had a 20-acre pasture that they leased to a livestock producer. That pasture needed to be renovated. They got an NRCS contract, which was with them for the renovation. However, the farmer who was leasing the pasture had the actual equipment to do that renovation. So it was a three-way partnership. The specifics in terms of like how all that panned out on paper, I do not know. But those are not uncommon situations that NRCS can help you with.
I don't see any other questions in the chat or in the Q&A box.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for being on today's webinar. Thank you for those great questions. I would really appreciate it if you would take a couple minutes to do an evaluation of this webinar. Your feedback helps me understand how clear I was in conveying information and what other resources you could use as you move forward. So the evaluation is going to pop up in your browser when you leave today's webinar. Also, you'll get a reminder email tomorrow that will have both the link to the evaluation, but also have the link to the place where you can find our recorded webinars. From that recorded webinars link, you can actually click on the financing and mentorship and go in and look at those specific webinars, but you'll see that we have over 100 recorded webinars on our website, all different topics. And we encourage you to browse those and to really see if there's some other recorded information or handouts that will help you on your land access and farming journey. So thank you so much for joining today. We hope that you have a great rest of your week. The sun is out. I know we're all going to be busy, and we wish you the best. Please contact me if I can be of help. And thanks, Mackenzie, for your assistance today. Have a great rest of your day.